Dan, I know you as a Middle East guy, as a national security guy, but I'm very curious what this poster is you have behind your head, which appears to be in Italian, I think. I can only see like part of it. And it looks like a different side of Dan's interest spectrum that I may not be aware of.
So it is a Polish poster for the opera Don Giovanni. So you have the Italian in spirit, and it's socialist realism at its finest in some ways, and I find socialist realist art at times funny, rarely compelling, but I also love Don Giovanni. So it was a gift given to me that I treasure, to kind of have the strange mix of socialist realism and opera.
Just as socialist realist artists intended to be laughed at. I'm sure they were painting it like one day someone will laugh at this.
So I'm going to show you, if you can see, move my camera here. That is a map of Maryland that, if you are a reader of a certain generation, which may only be you, Scott, and probably not even you'll recognize as a Lord of the Rings style map in terms of the graphics, but it is of the state of Maryland.
Now you're speaking my language,
that's kind of cool.
That one gels more with what I know about you, Dan.
The joy of the internet is whatever bizarre, narrow interest you have, you can find it.
I want to know what a Polish socialist take on Don Giovanni, or really any opera, sounds like. I feel like opera already is very wrought, and taking it and dropping it in like an Eastern European context has got to like amplify it dramatically. Have you actually seen the opera, or have you just gotten the poster for the
So
art?
I did not see it in its context. My sense from reading, I'm embarrassed to say I've forgotten her name, the German novelist who has written so kind of eloquently about the kind of end of the Cold War period in East Germany. And there, the kind of, I'll say, highbrow culture is tremendously important to these groups of people in a way that just wasn't, I think, to not just most Americans, but I would say most American intellectuals, where it's entertainment rather than, let us today discuss, Goethe, right? So
that is our third topic, Dan. Don't spoil it for the listeners before we get there. But just wait for it.
No, Scott's kidding. We're Philistines.
Yeah, it's true.
Also known as Goethe if you're in Chicago. So.
Classic Goethe. I like it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rational Security. I am your host, Scott R. Anderson, thrilled to be back with some more of my Lawfare colleagues as we invite you to come join us, members of the Lawfare team, as we try to make sense of the week's biggest national security news stories. This week, I'm thrilled to be joined once again by Lawfare Managing Editor Tyler McBrien. Tyler, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Always a pleasure, Scott.
And back after a fairly long absence, although I suspect Dan may be the longest standing national security guest of all four of us currently on the show. I think he was on probably before my time once or twice back in the day. Dan Byman, Lawfare Editor Extraordinaire. Many years. Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
That's the nicest way someone's ever told me I'm old. Good to be here, Scott.
Not old, only extended in being in Ben's Rolodex for so many years. I think the fact that your last name starts with B also means I suspect you got a lot more calls and texts from Ben as he was trying to fill out Rational Security casts in those early years. But we're thrilled that we could pull you from our Rolodex and pull you on to the podcast today to talk about a few topics particularly up your alley that you've been writing on. And making her Rational Security debut, we of course have Lawfare Associate Editor for Communications, Anna Hickey. Anna, thank you so much for joining us here on Rational Security.
Thanks for having me on.
For folks who may not know, Anna took over the incredibly important, if highly onerous task of doing extended Twitter feeds that I started when I took over this podcast and then quickly abandoned to Anna's very competent, some might say more competent than me, management. Where she's been a part of the Rational Security community and voice and team for a very long time, but thrilled to finally have her voice here on the podcast talking over the week's big news for us. And a big week it has been in the news. We've got a number of topics, in particular foreign affairs topics, that have been popping up in this week. A few weeks out from the election, a lot of eyes are focused on domestic issues, but the rest of the world continues afoot, and we have a lot of developments worth talking over. Topic 1 for this week, some vacancies in management. Israeli forces unintentionally hit their number one target last week when an Israeli military patrol in Gaza stumbled across and killed Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, who is widely believed to be a major, if not the main architect behind the October 7th massacre. It's the latest in a series of military operations that have left the leadership ranks of both Hamas and Hezbollah decimated, in quite literal terms. But what are these changes at the top likely to mean for these organizations? Is this an opportunity for peace or an opening to greater escalation? Topic 2. Forgotten or not forgotten enough? Sudan has spent the past several months spiraling towards a political and humanitarian crisis of historical proportions, driven in substantial part by the agendas of outside powers. But the situation has received relatively little attention from the global media or broader international community, at least by many measures. What do we need to know about the Sudan crisis, and how does or should U.S. policy enter into the equation? And topic 3, persona non grata, eh? So we've read a little international law joke for international lawyers out there. Relations between Canada and India have hit a new low as Canadian officials have accused Indian officials of leading a campaign to intimidate and interfere with Sikh nationals resident in Canada as part of a broader international campaign. While Canada has gone so far as to expel several involved Indian diplomats, its traditional allies, including the United States, have remained far less confrontational with India, despite concerns over similar types of behavior. What explains this difference in approach, and what tack should the United States take moving forward? So for our first topic, Dan, I want to turn to you first, because you wrote a really insightful piece on this topic for Foreign Policy magazine, and we know few people know Hamas, as well as Hezbollah and other groups in the region, but particularly Hamas, better than you do, as somebody who's been watching them for many decades at this point, a variety of capacities. Yahya Sinwar has become a notorious figure. In a lot of ways, he was the manifestation, the figurehead, the focus of Hamas. In a lot of ways, I think the Gaza military campaign after October 7th, a person of individual reputation for, depending on how you look at it, evil, savvy to some extent as well, his ability to organize something as horrendous, yet also as terrifying and deliberately terrifying as the October 7th massacre. And in particular, somebody on whom a lot of people put the onus for Hamas doing something that resembled to many on the outside, at least, as something approaching a suicide pact, something people knew was going to have a devastating impact, not just on Israel, but on the Palestinian population of Gaza, and in many ways, perhaps more broadly across the region. Tell us a little bit about Sinwar's role. How much of this is legend? How much of this is fact in terms of the actual role he played in Hamas? And what you make of the fact that, he has now somewhat coincidentally exited the picture through this kind of accidental stumbling across, although Israel certainly is happy it happened and was certainly making an effort in that direction anyway. What is the implications that it have for Hamas as an organization?
Sinwar, the reputation to me is actually quite accurate. He's someone who was one of the most consequential figures in Hamas's history. He's, an early member. He plays a key role in building up its security wing, and then goes to jail for a while, is released as part of a broader prisoner exchange, and as a result, learns a lesson that I think, most groups have learned, which is taking Israeli hostages can be quite, in a political sense, lucrative. You can get big exchanges for relatively small numbers of Israelis. But Sinwar was also known for really becoming a specialist on Israel. He devoured Hebrew newspapers. He was fascinated by the broader debates going on in Israel. So he was someone who was, quite smart and quite informed. And this attack, as everyone knows, was really unprecedented in scope and scale. And clearly Sinwar orchestrated this in how could he surprise Israel? And he did so somewhat amazingly, despite Israeli intelligence having detected the plot. He was able to convince them through other means that, it's just an exercise, they're not serious. And, I would say he deserves, I would use the word blame, not credit, but a lot of the blame for everything that has happened since, right? The horrible tragedy on October 7th itself, and then the inevitability of, at least what I feel, is the devastating Israeli response. It is, I don't know what the right word is, but the fact that Israel finds him almost by accident really does stand in contrast with the attacks we've seen in Lebanon recently and other attacks in Gaza where leaders like Mohammed Deif have been killed by these massive airstrikes. This was just a case of, he stumbles along and they get him. I would say these things, are frequent in conflict, though, which is that leaders have to move around and they leave shelter, and as a result, they become vulnerable. But this is potentially a big moment, but I'm not sure it's going to end up being one. So this is a huge win for Israel, right? Netanyahu can say, we got the key figure for October 7th. In fact, politically, it would be impossible to say that Israel didn't destroy Hamas as long as Sinwar was alive, right? So with Sinwar dead, Israel can say, look, we've inflicted all these harms on Hamas, and as a result, it's much weaker. And look, we even got Sinwar and other senior leaders. So it was a necessary condition. But on the ground in Gaza, this week seems a lot like last week. Right, there doesn't seem to be dramatic change in terms of the type of Israeli operations. And I'll say this because I kind of say it every time the subject comes up. The big question for me in Gaza is what comes next. Right? Yes, Israel's hit Hamas hard, but in order to actually destroy Hamas in a true sense, you need a replacement. And as far as I can tell, Israel has yet to float a credible plan, or really any plan, along those lines. And this is something that U.S. leaders who were burned by Afghanistan, burned by Iraq, were pushing Israel on October 8th, right? This is not a new topic. And yet we've seen no progress on this. So I worry that 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, we could be having a similar discussion.
Dan, I really enjoyed your piece, especially right in the beginning when you said that this was more of an anticlimax than a turning point, because I felt the same. I mean, it was a period. It was a punctuation mark, but for a long time, the Israeli government has called Sinwar a dead man walking. It just had this sense of inevitability, and now that it happened, again, the question of what comes next is still lingering, and so it's almost, as you said so well, it's an anticlimax. What I've been interested in is again something you brought up which is how he was found and how he was killed. The first answer being sort of accidentally. He was sort of stumbled upon, not where Israeli intelligence thought he was. He was, for one, above ground. At least that's what a video of the last moments of his life before he was shot shows. But speaking of that video, I'm also curious, Dan and Scott and Anna, what you make of this choice by the Israeli government to release the video publicly. They often release footage of strikes and attacks, but this one seemed to me like a blunder. I mean, it can be a Rorschach test, of course, of some people, some commentary I saw on Twitter saying, look at this person, it's sort of pathetic how he died in this house. But most people, even the New York Times, use the word defiant. I mean, the video portrays him with his sort of last motion throwing a stick or something at the Israeli drone. I'm not sure how it does anything but galvanize the movement further, even though it's been fairly decimated. Stephen Cook had a piece also in Foreign Policy where he says history shows that you can't kill your way out of a resistance movement, and this footage seems to just fuel the resistance. But I don't know what other people made of that video that was released.
So I think Israel released it for domestic political reasons, right? This was a victory lap for the Israeli military and for the Israeli government. But you're right. I don't think that most people seeing that are going to, look and say, how pathetic Sinwar is. It's not, to me, the Saddam Hussein video where his head is being checked for lice, right? This isn't the diminishing of someone who is this fearsome figure. It does suggest he was defiant to his last, and I think it will hearten those who embraced what Hamas was doing and won't hurt his reputation anyway. So I do think it was a mistake. I don't think it's one that's going to matter too much in the grand scheme of things, but I was surprised they released it.
Your question about the future of this organization, Tyler, raises, I think, a good set of questions to me about these kind of decapitation moves generally, which have become a big part of the Israeli military operation, really more so in Lebanon the last few weeks even than Gaza. I mean, in Gaza, we know they've been targeting Hamas leadership for a long time now with some success. As obviously, we saw Ismail Haniyeh's, assassination in Tehran, or in Iran. And so, that also was an effort there. But in Lebanon, it's really been an effort to carve out the leadership, was in a lot of ways the first salvo. It started with the pager strikes and communications devices. And I'm wondering how it fits into the strategy here for these organizations, because these organizations, and Hezbollah even more than Hamas, really are products to some extent, or at least heavily coached by the IRGC, Iran's kind of paramilitary forces, which are very experienced in cultivating insurgent movements. In Iraq, a context I'm most familiar with, they did so with a very consciously decentralized model, building up lots of separate centers of power, separate sort of nodes within a kind of sometimes a loose hierarchy. In Iraq, it was more fractured, certainly, than Lebanon, where there was the Hezbollah umbrella and leadership, and Nasrallah himself had a huge pull, given how long he had had a leadership role there. But I worry that sometimes when you cut the head off the snake in this case, you're not, killing the snake, you're creating a hydra, right? You're creating an opportunity for a lot of smaller leaders to act out and do so maybe in ways that are less predictable, harder to manage, a little more chaotic, because you're not dealing with one organization that has some strategic coordination. My sense is that's what happened in Iraq after the Soleimani killing. We went into a period where Iraq became highly unstable for months and months. It got kind of tamped down by, frankly, the global pandemic. But you saw lots of insurgent groups doing stuff that we had never seen them do before. And in ways that it's not clear to me, like Iran may have had a role in stymieing, or at least forcing them to hold in reserve to use strategically. And it seemed to take a number of months for Iran to really reestablish kind of a degree of control over them when they come in, which has come into play, in the context of this conflict, where we've seen Iran kind of turn on and off pressure, both in Iraq and in regards to the Houthis in response to global affairs. That's good and bad. It gives Iran leverage, but it also means Iran's an entity you can negotiate with. Dan, I'm kind of curious about your thoughts about that. Like how, especially in Hezbollah, where we know they've had units cycling in and out of Syria for the better part of a decade now, more than a decade, with substantial kind of combat field experience. Is there a generation of leaders that's going to step up in this? Or are there still elements of the organization that are going to be more operational and maybe with a freer hand than there were before? Or am I being too much of a nervous Nelly about this sort of scenario?
To me, it's definitely a realistic scenario. Hezbollah has a very deep leadership bench. And historically, it's been able to replace lost leaders very effectively. What Israel has done, though, both with the current assassination campaign, but also things like the pager operation, is it's tried to go into that bench in a very comprehensive way. And this, I think, Scott, is somewhat comparable to what the United States tried to do with al-Qaeda in Iraq, what Israel did in the Second Intifada, which was not just go after, the names we might have heard of, but also logisticians, recruiters, skilled trainers, people who are really the kind of lesser-known people who make organizations function. And I would highlight kind of two effects of these. One is, of course, as you start to go after senior people, you have a lot of replacement. The organization itself gets very confused, right? If you imagine any organization where the boss or bosses are constantly changing and mid-level people are constantly changing, effectiveness goes down. But the other is it's hard for people to communicate, right? So if you're Hezbollah, you can't pick up the phone, you can't use email, you can't use a pager, right? And it's really hard, it's hard to run a, small office at a university without advanced communications these days, right? Let alone a major terrorist organization or a major insurgent group. So to me, the effects can be quite profound. But, I think probably the best example of what you're saying is looking over at Mexico, right, where the U.S. did a very effective, if you will, decapitation campaign of, taking out some of the most senior drug lords. And the result was this tremendous increase in competition among more junior folks that was far more violent, right? And obviously, political violence is different than drug violence. But the idea that you'd have these different leaders who are on different pages, some using more violence, some using less, and less coherent, I definitely think that's possible. I believe Israel would say, look, there's a war going on. And if the enemy is less coherent, if there's more rivalries internally, that's great, right? I think it makes it harder after the shooting stops because you'll have a lot more spoilers. There won't be a figure like Nasrallah who can say, okay, everyone, we're done today, and blow the whistle, and everyone stands up straight and listens. So I think that will be harder. That said, Hezbollah has a fairly hierarchical organization, and I think it will still have that discipline. The one where I think it may be different, actually, is Hamas. You have this question of really who's going to be the leader of Hamas. And the likely candidates are right now in Doha. And, I don't know who the next leader is going to be, but, if it's someone like Khalid Mishal, who, is a very senior figure, there's a question of whether the Doha-based figures can actually control Gaza. right? How do they communicate with people there? Do they have any, respect among the fighters beyond a general, vague sense that there are some people living in a hotel in Doha who are claiming to speak for our organization? And so I think that you might see some fracturing within Hamas between different parts of the organization geographically. But the important caveat there is Hamas for years has been able to manage this organization that has, many members in prison, many members in the West Bank, members in refugee camps, some in Doha and some in Gaza, and has done so successfully. So I would raise it as a question rather than as a likelihood.
Yeah, that's something that I had been thinking about is this killing of Sinwar, is this going to lead to more international influence in Gaza? Were we going to see Iran or Hezbollah try to extend their footprint within Gaza itself? Or do you see that as less of a likely possibility just because it's already been so separated from so much of the world? This leads to my second part of my question, which is, what is now Israel's endgame? Because at the beginning, at October 7th, after the horrific attack last year, they said they wanted to decimate Hamas. But what does that mean at this point? After they kind of left northern Gaza a few months ago, there was all this reporting that Hamas was back and they were taking back places that Israel had cleared. So what is their goal at this point now that they've killed Sinwar but are staying in Gaza, it seems like, for the foreseeable future?
So the Iran question is to me a big one. And Sinwar was reportedly one of the Hamas members who was most eager to engage Iran. And that fits the broader, he's a hardliner. Iran was more interested in violence than in negotiations or Hamas governing. So that there's a alignment there. For Iran, these ties to groups like Hamas have been both a tremendous success and a burden. Right, so a success in that this has been a way of putting pressure on Israel. It disrupted the Saudi-Israel normalization efforts, but also it changed the tone in the entire region. So all of a sudden you have a discussion of, Israel is horrible, and so are the countries that back it, which include Iran's Arab rivals, but especially include the United States. And that's a discussion Iran wants, as opposed to discussions about the Syrian civil war, for example, where Iran was very much against the majority of regional opinion. But at the same time, Iran is now being called on to act as its proxy groups, especially its most important group, Hezbollah, is decimated, and it doesn't seem to have much in its arsenal. Now, I may be speaking too soon, possible I'll be surprised, but Iran's responses have not been very effective, and Israel has been able to hit Iran, but especially hit its proxy groups. And so I think Iran wants these groups as a threat. It wants limited violence, but at times this puts Iran in a very bad political position. To go to Anna's second question about the Israel's endpoint in Gaza, I'm not sure they have one. Right? And this is, to me, the big question, which is, okay, you've killed Sinwar, you've killed a lot of the senior leaders, you've destroyed much of the rank and file. Gaza itself is, rubble in much of the area. What do you want there? And right now, Israel has not deployed huge numbers of forces. So Hamas fighters pop up wherever Israel leaves, and that's a kind of basic counterinsurgency lesson is you need a force presence, in most of the country in order to prevent the other side from going back to areas you thought you cleared, and that's not a surprise. And so I don't think they have an answer to that other than killing more Hamas people. And, the target list is pretty big, right? And it will keep growing because there'll be new leaders and figures who emerge. But that basic question of, okay, we've displaced Hamas from this territory, what should take its place? To me, they haven't answered, and it's in part because it's a very contentious answer. I can criticize any answer someone else gives, right? That's one of the joys of my job. But they have to come up with something and then support it, and that's going to be difficult, and it's probably going to be a political loser issue because it will involve at least some concessions to someone with a Palestinian identity. And so I think they're delaying it, but the result is this war, to me, months ago had achieved, was at diminishing returns, and I think that's continuing.
Dan, this question about how this relates to Iran brings forward another question that I've been asking myself, which is what does the experience of the last few weeks mean for how Israel certainly, and to some extent, like big parts of the United States and the international community think about Iran. Because for the last 10 years, we've seen the kind of aftermath of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which really focused on trying to cabin Iran's nuclear program while setting to the side, not saying these weren't issues, but setting to the side for the time being concerns about Iran's more conventional activities, support for terrorism, various destabilizing activities around the region. And the criticism of that we heard most vocally from Bibi Netanyahu, but also from others around the region, the Gulf states, from a big political contingent in the United States was, look, all this other stuff really matters. This is a real problem. This is where Iran is really dangerous, is on the conventional side, not the nuclear side, or in addition to the nuclear side. We can't sacrifice one for the other. Yet, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen Iran's major proxies pretty heavily decimated by a concentrated military campaign. Iran's response, as you noted, has been fairly limited. I do think, this is a multi-year question. We don't know what the full scope of their response is. Like they've always been the slow boil sort of response. They ratchet and sink resources into a multi-year insurgency, essentially. But, that's something that's maybe manageable for states as opposed to, more concentrated military presence like Hezbollah was on Israel's northern border. So does that change this calculus about this concerns that people have raised about Iran, about the nuclear, folder versus the conventional folder? And how does that enter into a potential Israeli response, which we're all still waiting on? I mean, the reports say Israel has told the United States it's not going to hit nuclear facilities or oil facilities. It's just going to hit military targets. And presumably that's as a model that the United States thinks is less likely to escalate further. But what does that tell us about how Israel is thinking about the Iran threat moving forward? Has it revealed itself to be a little bit of a paper tiger on the conventional front? And does that mean the nuclear front is actually a much higher priority? Was that maybe the Obama administration right in making that a higher priority? Because that's where Iran can really jump into another category where it poses a very different type of threat. And these conventional capabilities have been a little more less of the serious concern that maybe people thought they were going to be.
So I work on, sub-state groups and hybrid warfare and terrorism. So, professionally, if you will, I have a bias. But I've always thought nuclear weapons are utterly terrifying, and they should be in a category by themselves. And you want to keep them out of the hands of bad actors, so it makes sense to prioritize them. One of the, I don't know if the word is surprises, but one of the bits of good news, I would say, in the last years is even as negotiations have fallen apart, Iran does not seem to have pursued full weaponization, right? It's close, as I understand it, but it hasn't gone completely down that road. And so there's a question, which I think the Biden administration is wrestling with now, which is, well, what pushes them all the way down that road, right? And so I would say the fear that, look, if we don't stop it today, in 3 months, they're going to actually, be a nuclear power. People, I think, are a little less afraid of that than they would have been 2-3 years ago, right? I think that was a real concern when Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, that, okay, this is it. I, at least, did not anticipate the scale and effectiveness of Israel's efforts to go after, especially Hezbollah, but Iranian proxies. And so when I kind of look around at Iran's capabilities, to me, they're much weaker than they were 6 months ago. And Hamas being one of the most important groups, that's obviously much weaker, but especially Hezbollah, which I put as kind of the number one proxy, the most capable, most loyal to Iran. And to me, has been, in the short term, hit very hard. It's a very capable group. So to me, there's a lot of long-term potential that remains, but still a concern. So I wouldn't say people have overstated this because these groups can cause a lot of domestic problems. Scott, you're more familiar than I am with Iraq, but I would highlight just the capabilities that the Iranians have within Iraq to really shape domestic politics there, and how these groups, the violent groups, play a significant role. So I think this is still a real concern. I think there should be focus on it, and I think it expands Iran's influence through the region.
So let's shift focus now from one challenging, difficult, fairly depressing corner of the world to another one, just one small Red Sea away, and one more continent away, in Africa, in the nearby, by some measures, country of Sudan, which has been the focus of crisis in a way for several decades now, but in recent months has been on a trajectory towards what many think might be the worst humanitarian crisis in living memory, or at least come close. A combination of conflict, a combination of famine, a combination of warring parties uninterested or unwilling to make severe strategic or even relatively limited strategic compromises to allow humanitarian access for broad swaths of the civilian population, looks like it is potentially kicking off a truly horrendous situation. Yet it is not one that we see featured prominently on the front page of the newspaper. It's there. You can read the Times and the Post coverage of it, which is excellent in many ways. But it's not on the front page. It's not featured in presidential debates. It's not getting sort of attention that we would have hoped. There's a small exception around UN General Assembly, where we saw Sudan was raised in profile as an issue that a lot of states tried, and particularly the United States tried to kind of make a focus of debates there, in part because Ukraine and Gaza were not things that people thought were going to make progress on. But the progress that reportedly came out of that, relatively limited in terms of commitments to change tack and pressure the parties towards negotiations. Anna, you've been following Sudan stuff for the past few weeks as one of the areas you've taken an interest in addition to your lawfare responsibilities. Talk to us a little bit about the dynamics. What is the state of affairs kind of on the ground in Sudan, and how does it fit into the kind of broader geostrategic picture that is the connective tissue we see between Gaza, Ukraine, domestic politics of a number of countries, including ours, and probably Sudan as well to some extent?
Yeah, for those who have not been following Sudan since 2019, there was a brief moment of incredible optimism in 2019 where the dictator who'd been around for 30 years, Omar al-Bashir, was deposed, was couped by a popular revolt, and then the situation has just devolved since then. The tentative civilian government that had a treaty with the military, that government collapsed in February of 2022. And since then, it's just been a military back in control of the country. And then last April 2023, the armed forces that had couped the civilian government in 2022 began a civil war in the country. So the major forces are the Sudanese Armed Forces and then the Rapid Support Forces. For those who might recognize Rapid Support Forces, that came out of the Janjaweed militias that just perpetrated horrendous atrocities in Darfur in the early 2000s. Sudan really has not changed since April of 2023 when the civil war broke out. It's just been these two, armed forces committing atrocities against civilians with the backing of other international communities and countries, and just fighting each other. And not a lot of ground has been taken by either side. The major city in Sudan, Khartoum, has continued to be a battle site, with neither the SAF or RSF making significant progress in taking over the city. And so it's an incredibly depressing situation. The famine looks like it might reach 25 million people will be under famine by the end of the year because of not only the humanitarian crisis caused by the conflict, but also because, as you mentioned, there's been a lot of natural, almost disasters with flooding that have wiped out any sort of crops that are there. Additionally, it's been impacted by the Ukraine war. A lot of Ukraine's grain goes to Africa. And because of the Russia-Ukraine war, less of that grain has been, going into Africa and especially Sudan. So right now, the big focus on the Sudan conflict is the UAE's support of the RSF. It's been something that the New York Times had a pretty massive expose about, that the UAE is using the Red Crescent, which is the Muslim version of the Red Cross, to smuggle in weapons. So they're saying they're providing aid, but bringing in weapons and drones to support the RSF. So that's kind of the state of play. While the Biden administration has spoken out against the conflict in Sudan, there's been not a lot of specific UAE criticism, especially people were hoping when the Emirati leader came to visit that Biden was going to say something, but neither he nor Harris addressed the Sudan conflict with him, at least in public.
And let me ask you something that I always find, I'll say, fascinating or depressing, right? Which is, I talk to young people on a fairly regular basis in my role as professor. And as people very interested in international affairs. And we can talk about Ukraine and we can talk about Gaza, but we don't talk about Sudan. And the scale is staggering. right? I mean, the numbers they're so big that I can't wrap my head around them in terms of the number of innocent people who are likely to die in the coming months. What is your thinking on why Sudan gets, dramatically less attention, and there isn't, even among people who follow world affairs, there isn't much attention to it?
I honestly am of two thoughts on this. One of is just it's in Africa, and Africa tends to be kind of ignored, especially by the quote unquote blob in DC, just because Africa is brought up when the US talks about its geopolitical relations with Russia and China and trying to gain influence. But, you hear less about what is actually going on in places like the Congo or the Sahel region in general. I think my other thought on this is that Ukraine and the Israel-Gaza war are brought up more just because the US has a larger footprint, and it seems like there might be a solution. It sounds very odd to say that Israel-Gaza is more solvable, but I think to some people it feels more solvable than Sudan, because in Ukraine, if you can push out the Russian forces, then you can have Ukraine and the Zelensky government just hold on to its territorial integrity, and there's some kind of hope, there's something you can push the US government to do. In Israel-Gaza, you can say, you want whether or not you want the U.S. to continue to arm the Israeli forces or stop arming them. There is a U.S. footprint in Israel. You also see that there could be a solution. There are possibilities of having some kind of Palestinian government in Gaza. You have some people in Israel and the United States who want Israeli governance in Gaza, but there's some kind of solution that can be found. But in Sudan, there's just, you don't want the SAF leading. You don't want the RSF leading. After you deposed al-Bashir, there isn't a large governance sector left. That's one of the reasons the humanitarian crisis is so bad, is there's just no governance in the country. Every time you'll read a report about how, there's 16 new trucks can enter Sudan through the Sudan-Chad border, but then all of a sudden they cross into what is now RSF territory, and they say, no, you can't. General Hamoud Hamedi has now said no more aid trucks. And so, in my view, part of it's that the U.S. is not necessarily funding one side or the other, the way they are with Ukraine or Israel, but also it is so unsolvable. It's just a bit of a bummer to think about.
Dan, I want to actually pick your brain about the weird regional dynamics around this, which I feel like actually reflects kind of an interesting shift in regional dynamics, particularly in the Middle East, which are some of the major drivers here, particularly from a bankrolling perspective. Because in this conflict, we see a weird split between two countries that often, at least in the last decade or two, have found themselves on the same side of a lot of conflicts. That's the UAE and Saudi Arabia, both of which obviously very wealthy countries with a lot of oil wealth and other sort of centrally housed wealth that they direct to have regional influence to different degrees. Historically, or at least for the last recent memory, I should say, they've often kind of been aligned in the big fissures that happen in the Middle East, right? There's kind of a big Iran, what do we do about Iran fissure? And they tend to be on the same side there. There's a big, what about political Islam? How do we feel about the Muslim Brotherhood and related groups? And they were historically on the same side there, to the point that they coordinated to kind of isolate and embargo and boycott Qatar back in the early Trump administration, as folks may remember, right? A big split among the Gulf states that are nominally in alliance of sorts in the Gulf Cooperation Council. Both U.S. allies and kind of anti-terrorism states and states willing to engage with Israel, as we've seen through the Abraham Accords. So how do we account for this big split around this conflict? And what does it tell us about both their bilateral relationship and maybe the trajectory those regional dynamics might be headed down? Is this just a weird exception to the general trend, or is it a sign of things to come?
So I want to take us back to the beginning of the major Saudi intervention in Yemen in 2015, where both it and the UAE seemed to be working very closely. They were both opposed to the Houthis. They were doing different things, but their policies seemed in alignment. If you fast forward a couple of years, though, that alliance began to break apart. And the Saudis and the UAE began to back different organizations and different entities and had very different emphases. And the Saudis began to reduce their role while the UAE continued to work with a range of groups. And in general, the UAE really seemed to see Yemen as part of a broader Red Sea strategy. Right? And so, what we do in the United States because of kind of historic bureaucratic relations is, Yemen is the Middle East, right? And Sudan is Africa. But of course, they're next to each other, right? And they have tremendous historic ties and ties among peoples and migratory flows and so on. And so I think they were breaking apart in different ways before that. They still have a lot of common interests, right? So it's not an absolute divide. And in Sudan, we have seen them on opposite sides. And I think they have different views of, who the best particular militia is to support, what that person has promised. There seem to be side deals involving a significant flow of gold going into the UAE. So I think they simply, look at the conflict and believe they'll get more out of one warlord while the other believes they'll get more out of another warlord. I'm not sure this is one of those big philosophical differences, but rather a much more kind of nuts and bolts thing.
I wanted to put something out there that I think kind of ties together this question about other actors and then also why a crisis of such magnitude that compounds a climate crisis on a refugee crisis on a humanitarian crisis is not getting the attention it deserves, especially in the US and Europe, is that I think there is just not an understanding that, to Dan's point, that this has very much also become a proxy conflict, and it's not spoken about in those terms. And I think because there's a perception, whether it's fueled by old racist colonial tropes, whether it's fueled by just a lack of attention and ignorance toward Africa, that this is something to be expected from Sudan or other African countries who have been embroiled in conflict. And that, why would it be framed as a proxy conflict? It's just these ethnic groups who can never get along. And so there'll always be warring, and then there's just not an attempt to understand it further. So I think that all of these dynamics play together of why this has become a forgotten conflict. There's also a strange dynamic. I mean, I did a podcast with Kieran Donnelly and Reva Dhingra of the IRC back in April of 2024 of calling it a forgotten conflict. And it almost has this element of, why is nobody talking about this? Where everyone is talking about it, but also still framing it as a forgotten conflict. And I just wanted to also agree with Anna on this perception of hopelessness or it can be very dejecting to see it persist so many years without resolution. You may say, as Anna was pointing out, that there haven't been actual real efforts toward resolution in terms of holding some of these patrons accountable. But I think it's just all a very dejecting mix that can lead to either turning a blind eye or throwing your hands up and saying this is just how it is.
And that, any sort of depressing situation would not be complete if we did not talk about Russia's role in it. And that is certainly true here. And we've seen particularly Russia's role get a kind of spotlight shone on it this week because of an airplane crash in which a number of Russian personnel appear to have been killed, which just underscores its involvement primarily, as I understand it, through Wagner, the kind of now reconstituted mercenary organization that we've seen make inroads through a broad swath of Africa, particularly in the wake of coups that have led U.S. and French forces to put them under political pressure to reduce their military presence, to withdraw, Wagner stepping in, kind of often on the narrative push that Wagner and Russia don't make the sort of demands that the United States does for governments, which might be particularly appealing if you're a recently established military dictator of sorts or aspiring military dictator. But also, I think, oversimplifies the narrative, the dynamics a little bit. What is Russia doing in Sudan, Anna, and how does it fit into this picture? Is it a major player, or is it a little bit more on the margins than compared to the UAE and Saudi Arabia and other regional actors?
Yes, it hadn't been a major player for a while, and in the past about 3 or 4 months, especially since the Wagner Group has reconstituted and now has a new name. I believe it's the Russia Corps. Especially since the, death and killing of Yevgeny Prigozhin, and the Wagner Group is now entirely focused on Africa. There's been more activity. A lot of it's been hard to tell what is actual Russian forces and what is just kind of, misinformation. And so I think that there is, in regards to the UAE, they appear to have a very large African gold and Sudanese gold trade going out of Abu Dhabi specifically, which is why they are sending weapons and drones to the RSF, who then funnel gold to the UAE. It appears that the Russians are sending people and troops and not just weapons, which is something that the Ukrainians allegedly are also doing. There hasn't been a ton of substantiated reporting, But since there's been reporting that there are Russians on the ground in Sudan, the Ukrainian government has begun to send assistance to certain Sudanese forces. And I think this all really goes to Tyler's point that this is just a proxy conflict on a proxy conflict. You have Iranian forces backing some of the SAF, but also so much of the Sudanese armed forces is divided into multiple militias, all of which have their own different perspectives on different countries. And so I think while the Russians are beginning to increase their footprint in Sudan, so far they're nowhere near the point that the UAE is at in its influence in perpetuating the conflict.
Yeah, I recently spoke with Vonda Felba Brown on the Lawfare podcast as well about, well, I was really looking back at 1 year of Prigozhin's death and also more so of the Africa Corps' actions in Mali. But we spoke more about Russia's goals broadly in Africa. And there are several dimensions: economic, access, anti-Western, sphere of influence type arguments. But we spoke less so about the U.S.'s role or potential role. So I'm curious, Scott or anyone, what is the U.S.'s role here? What has the U.S. done? What should it do, especially in Sudan?
It's a really good question. And it's true. I mean, the United States has kind of like interestingly, within Africa, a continent and a region, particularly sub-Saharan Africa in particular, that is, I think, historically neglected by U.S. policy. Kind of notoriously understaffed at the State Department, historically into the present day, often is spoken of as a new priority by incoming administrations, but rarely really manifests. It gets overlooked pretty substantially. Sudan is not a complete exception to that, but gets a little bit more of attention from U.S. engagement, in part because we saw Sudan after the removal of Omar al-Bashir in 2019, I think it was, if I recall correctly. We saw this rapid engagement of a normalization with the United States. We saw a claim settlement agreement dealing with a bunch of terrorism claims, an effort to normalize a relationship that had been heavily disrupted because Sudan was a designated state sponsor of terrorism and had been for more than 2 decades at that point, since I think at least 1998. And had been in this kind of pariah status. And the United States had also engaged fairly aggressively in Sudan over the South Sudan, the establishment of a separate state from a part of what had been part of Sudan earlier in the century. The United States played a very active role in that, State Department personnel actively facilitating that, an experiment that has presented its own challenges and difficulties, to say the very least, but nonetheless did get a lot of U.S. attention. That all doesn't amount to necessarily like a major skin in the game for commitments. I think the United States has been very active in diplomacy on this issue. It did steer a lot of attention towards it during General Assembly week. They have appointed a new special envoy, Tom Perriello, who I think sometimes people think, oh, that's that weird Virginia congressman, big deal, who cares? But Tom's actually a very serious guy and a very experienced diplomat at this point. He's held like 3 or 4 different special envoy roles, including as Great Lakes special envoy during the Obama administration, which was a very hot portfolio at the time. So I think he reflects pretty serious commitment. And for these things, I think a good measure of it is how much direct access to the White House and the Secretary of State and envoys likely to have. And Tom Perriello, in part because he is a political guy as well, has that. He's somebody who can probably get in touch with Jake Sullivan or Tony Blinken pretty easily, which is not always the case with these special envoys. So I think I think it reflects that there's actually a seriousness here in trying to engage on it. He appeared on a crisis group podcast. I think it's called On the Horn or In the Horn, something The Horn. I feel terrible. I'm blanking on the name, which is an excellent podcast, even though I cannot remember the exact name, which focused on this region. And he kind of laid out the diplomatic strategy, which is trying to get the parties to the table, facilitate discussions, particularly opening space for humanitarian relief amidst the ongoing conflict. That sort of thing is never satisfying for outside advocates who always want to see bad actors called out when people are doing bad things, and particularly when they're U.S. allies like the UAE is, and the UAE does appear to be doing some pretty bad stuff here. But those things are really important in terms of the actual humanitarian situation on the ground. And particularly, I suspect with the United States, its approach to this is going to be a quieter one. Nobody believes when the United States says we are actually engaging our allies on this, unless they comes out as kind of like very loud, indignant kind of repudiations of countries for doing bad things. But that's often not very effective. Often, you do kind of maintain a degree of formality and friendship at a high level and engage in, actual direct channels when you have major issues of bilateral concern. I suspect those engagements are happening. I think the U.S. does things like elevate Sudan at the General Assembly week to put external pressure on UAE and other parties without having to call them out directly, and take some hits on the bilateral relationship. But the foundational dynamics right now, I think, are that UAE is also an essential actor when it comes to Gaza. Anything happening in the Middle East, it's still a major actor in kind of the Abraham Accord effort, meaning broader normalization effort. It has kind of played its hand there to a substantial extent, but nonetheless, it is going to play a major role in funding, staffing any post-Gaza situation, driving other countries to normalization, encouraging and subsidizing various efforts at normalization, improving regional stability. And it's played that role for a long time. And that's part of what makes it a valuable U.S. ally. And those interests have to be entered in when you're evaluating how the United States approaches Sudan, because the UAE may be a very problematic actor there, but it is an actor that plays more in line with U.S. interests in other contexts, if often somewhat problematically. So I think that helps explain why, the approach is quiet here. I think there is a serious diplomatic effort. Those are serious efforts. They do matter, and I'm sure there'll be, frankly, foreign assistance, at least, a future Trump administration, probably hostile to foreign assistance, but a Harris administration, I think, would be forthcoming with it. Those efforts will be there. They are serious. They mean something, and they could have a real impact on the ground. But it's not the United States dictating terms or really throwing its massive heft around. And that's because, frankly, Sudan probably just doesn't quite measure up with some of the other global priorities it's facing, and the same actors are involved there. Well, for our third topic, let us now change focus from situations where major powers are inserting their will in the rest of the world, and one of those situations where, to some extent, the rest of the world is inserting its preferences within a major power. And that has to do with a dust-up that has occurred the past few weeks between Canada and India. This is in a lot of ways the latest chapter of a longer saga that we have been tracking here at Rational Security and at Lawfare, because it's a really interesting one. It's a really interesting diplomatic story with a lot of angles. And for people who follow diplomacy in particular, as I do at least, I find it really interesting because it really shows the strange dynamics that can arise in diplomatic relationships, and particularly as where they intersect with broader political issues. We have seen Prime Minister Justin Trudeau call out the Indian government for playing a role, not only, as we have known for several months now, an alleged role with being involved in attempted and actual killings of kind of Sikh advocates that were located in Canada. They've been accused of similar efforts here in the United States and other countries around the world, but more recently also involved in a much more sustained campaign to impact domestic politics in Canada, electoral prospects, undermine a lot of Sikh candidates and, frankly, the broader Sikh population, of which there's a significant one in Canada's ability to advocate both for itself and for its global preferences, which for many Sikhs includes greater autonomy for Sikhs in India as well. That's kind of the underlying friction, why India treats Sikhs and often classifies Sikh political movements as terrorist organizations or something akin to that. The latest chapter is that happened in the saga, which is a big move, is the Canadian government kicked 6 Indian diplomats out of the country who are allegedly involved with these efforts. India then reciprocated and kicked 6 Canadian diplomats out who didn't do anything in particular, but appeared to have been 6 diplomats probably chosen for, to send a political message but not disrupt the parts of embassy operations like visa operations that Indians might care about, I suspect. Kick them out in a very traditional tit-for-tat move that these things often play out under. But it is becoming a major bilateral burr between these two countries, both of whom are important allies of the United States. Yet the United States and a lot of Canada's closest allies, think of the other Five Eyes countries, Australia, UK, New Zealand as well, they haven't leaned into this kind of confrontational approach with India, even though a number of them, at least the US and the UK, have similar concerns. We got reports just this week that the United States is really putting, through back channels, direct pressure on the Modi government for accountability for a similar case of an attempted assassination of an American here. But that is reported in the press. It is not coming out in, condemnations on the floor of the parliament as it did in Canada. Tyler, you've been following this case. Talk to us a little bit about how significant a development this is. Like, how big a problem is this, and big a bilateral issue or multilateral issue is it becoming? And what do you account for this kind of difference in approach between traditionally close allies like the United States and Canada?
Yeah, I think interesting is the perfect word for it. You mentioned that it's been bubbling for a while, but this latest flashpoint really does seem like an uptick in the confrontational nature of Canada's approach, because Prime Minister Trudeau, as you mentioned, implicated essentially everyone up to Modi and just senior level Indian government officials. And I should also note that India, for its part, completely denies involvement in any of this. But it was a very serious, high-level accusation, and I think they wouldn't make it unless they had extremely compelling intelligence and evidence on their end to do so. One of the reasons why I think it's confusing, and it has been confusing me ever since the news came out that the Sikh separatist and Canadian citizen Hardeep Nijjar was shot and killed back in June 2023, so over a year ago, was that the United States and Canada will have been, I think, turning a blind eye to Indian domestic authoritarianism for a long time in favor of building closer ties to India, encountering China. And these moves that India has been making of essentially, assassinations or assassination attempts on U.S. Canadian soil of Sikh separatists seems to imperil that good position that they've been in, especially since the Sikh separatist movement is nowhere near the threat it was in, I think, the 80s and 90s. It just seems like a very high risk, very, very little reward from the geopolitical foreign policy element. There are, I'm sure, very strong reasons domestically and also ideologically in terms of Hindu nationalism, but it's just been a head scratcher, I think, still for why India would imperil these close ties with the U.S. and Canada. In terms of the approach of the U.S. versus Canada, I think because my guess is because the assassination attempt was successful in Canada, they've sort of forced their hand to be more confrontational, and the ensuing investigation must have surfaced some really damning connections. Whereas in the United States, it was a foiled assassination attempt. The middleman that was allegedly hired for this murder for hire plot was, a U.S. agent, and so therefore it was foiled. So I think obviously the attempt versus actual successful assassination is a difference in severity, even though the intent may be the same. So I think that has to do with something. But again, I keep coming back to this gamble that doesn't really seem worth it that the Indian government seems to be making.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to ask you about. When I was reading all of the stories to prepare for this episode, I just kept running against the nobody seems to know why, like, now it is happening. So I was wondering, has the Sikh movement done anything in, like, the post-COVID era that you think the Narendra Modi government would push towards? Or is it any kind of, now that they've won another election in India, they're kind of feeling emboldened because of that? Just, can you hazard any kind of guess as to why now they've decided to do, these kind of murder for plot attempts? And also in Canada, when it was successful, did the attempted assassination in the States happen first? Why were the Americans able to prevent the attempt while it appeared to happen in Canada?
It's a good question. So I guess to answer the latter question first, I'm not sure the exact details of why the assassination. I think the assassination of Nijjar happened last year, as I said, in June 2023. This is something that confirmed, I think, a lot of what the Sikh community, the Sikh diaspora has been saying for a long time. And I think that then likely put intelligence services around the world on alert. That's my guess. I'm not sure the exact details of the U.S. investigation. To answer your question about the why, I keep returning to an article in Foreign Affairs from December of 2023 by Hartosh Singh Bal, who raised this very question. And the author landed on an ideological answer, which is that Sikh separatism endangers the idea of Hindu nationalism. Sikhs are a Hindu sect, but as the name separatism suggests, have not signed on to the Hindu nationalist project that Modi and his allies have been building. And so therefore, it's a threat to its very existence, even if on its surface, it doesn't seem like a very formidable threat to the BJP or something like that, or to the Indian government. That's the best answer I've come across, but I'm curious if Dan or Scott have more satisfying answers. I'm just not sure.
So I'm certainly not sure. I would just note in general, and I don't claim to know anything in detail on this case, that sometimes these assassination logics are operational, where they happen to get the right people in place at the right time, and that drove everything else. Right. So, sometimes there's a decision, if you will, that triggers everything. But in other cases, they're like, hey, we have an opportunity to kill this person or somewhat disrupt this person. Tyler, I did want to ask like a 30,000-foot question of you, but really anyone who wants to take it on, which is I tend to be sympathetic to administrations when they say, yeah, this is horrible, but. And, in India's case, India is, a key ally, perhaps, near the top of the list for broader U.S. concerns about China. And one thing that, people regularly criticize every administration for is, they're not prioritizing, right? They should, X is more important than Y. And the Biden administration has put China, at or near the top of its list. And, is it right then that it basically, I think Richard Pearl, the former Republican operative, used to call them marshmallows, right? Is it right that they issue a strict, stern warning to the Indians and then proceed about their day without having, anyone expecting it to work? Or should more be done on this? Obviously, this itself is like horrible that they're trying to kill politicians in an allied country. But the United States does have bigger fish to fry when it comes to dealing with the Indians.
Before I get into that, I also wanted to add one quick factor that may go to explain the difference in levels of confrontation between Canada and the United States, and that is demographics. The Sikh population makes up a much higher percentage of overall Canadian population. It's a much more prominent community. There's Sikh, I believe, ministers at the cabinet level. It's just a more prominent community, and therefore it's treated differently. But Dan, to your point, it is a good one. I think this goes back to what I was saying about the assassination attempt, especially in the United States, has forced our hand, I think, or the U.S. hand in terms of issuing an indictment. But, to Scott's original question, it still is quite a limited response when compared to Canada. So I think the U.S. government does realize there are bigger fish to fry with regard to India, and this was the lowest common denominator, or the minimum viable response, I think, was the indictment.
Yeah, and I see a little bit of a interesting strategy, and sometimes you could even see a little of a coordinated strategy, or maybe like even tacitly assented to division between these different parties. It's worth bearing in mind, if Canada has evidence that Modi's directly involved in this, and presumably it's going to come from intelligence sources, that information is almost certainly available to the United States, Australia, New Zealand, UK at a minimum. Certainly could be made available to them because they're Five Eyes partners. They have the most robust intelligence sharing arrangements. My guess is they probably already have access to it. Maybe they don't find it as persuasive. These things are never 100%. And Dan, I invite you to correct me on this because you know much more about the IC than I do. But that's my general understanding. So this is a tactical choice, right? It's not about maybe disagreement about what's known and what isn't known. They probably are operating from a really similar universe of known facts, which aren't absolute. But within that, you have Canada, which I think Tyler, you very astutely note, has a lot more domestic political and kind of like a principled reason they need to make a hard vocal stance about this, and probably very low tolerance because it's a big part of their population. 2% of the Canadian population, fourth biggest religious group in the country, is being targeted by a foreign power for intimidation. That's pretty massive, right? And so it's very hard to kind of ignore that and do it at kind of a low-key level. That is not the situation for most of these other parties. That doesn't mean that they aren't concerned about what India is doing here. But insofar as it's a much more targeted problem, it's something that, A, they may be able to more confidently be able to manage and manage the public consequences of, meaning in terms of like intimidation, chilling effect, things like that, through like conventional law enforcement with maybe a little bit of an assist from intelligence collection and things like that. And on top of that, it weighs just less heavily compared to these other interests. Now, if the United States and Australia can keep India as a strategic partner to counterbalance China, Canada benefits from that too. So Canada might very well be okay with these countries not coming full out as vocally against India because they recognize it's actually maybe important to keep India in the broader strategic fold, but we need to put pressure on India again or on certain targeted behaviors. I suspect that's how the United States and Australia too. They don't like this sort of behavior. It's a big problem for them. We've seen in the China context, a lot of other contexts. I'm sure they think it's an actual genuine problem here too. But what that allows them to do is to say, okay, Canada, you can take a much more symbolic stance. You eat maybe the bilateral costs, but the broader strategic picture, we can help maintain more through our engagements with India. And then on top of that, they can go to India and say, hey, we really need you guys to look into this. They've said Modi, it goes all the way to the top with Modi. We're not willing to say that or reach that conclusion yet, but you need to see real accountability up the chain. And what that does is it creates a little bit of a split between the senior leadership and the operational level people, where you can see scapegoating. Maybe there is a genuine division and uncertainty there that can be brought to the fore, but by pushing for accountability at the higher level, you make it more politically costly for those officials without imposing that cost on them yet. You give them an incentive to say, I'm going to stop this behavior and maybe throw a few people under the bus for accountability measures to kind of segregate it out to save the broader relationship. More than anything else, it reminds me of how the Trump administration approached the Khashoggi killing. And that was problematic and I think objectionable in part because we had intelligence assessments so confidently concluding as Congress was able to squeeze out the administration that MBS was directly involved with that, more likely directly involved with that. Although again, those aren't bulletproof. We don't know 100%. But from a strategic perspective, you can see how it makes sense. And in that case, it does appear to have gotten MBS to rein in some of his broader problematic conduct he was pursuing in various corners. He has become much more of a kind of rogue actor than he was in those first 18 months or 2 years of the Trump administration. And it led to real accountability measures, like people were actually brought forward and involved in the operation. Again, there's a real question as to whether they're the ones who are ultimately responsible, but it underscored to the Saudi apparatus, to Saudis, to other people, hey, this was wrong. We're not going to do this. We shouldn't be doing this. And these people are going to go to jail for it. And so it stigmatizes those policies domestically. So I kind of suspect you're seeing a similar tack here with India, driven by those strategic factors. And I'm not sure it's something that Canada wouldn't co-sign given the broader dynamic. Just Canada plays a different role in the strategy than the United States and other countries do.
The last factor I might throw into the mix that might explain the Indian government's behavior here is the generally high favorability among the Indian diaspora around the world of Modi and his project. I don't have the most recent polling figures at my fingertips, but I get the sense that he despite these actions, he is quite favorable domestically and in the diaspora, which may suggest that he feels that he can do things like this with a bit more impunity than just Canadian government statements would have you believe. I think I was listening to some reporting that this actually has backfired on Canada among some Indian populations, and now there's anti-Canadian sentiment of the audacity for Justin Trudeau to accuse Prime Minister Modi of this. So I think that's also a strong factor. I mean, Modi has a fairly strong mandate among Indians, and so I think that is also in the back of his head.
Fair enough. All right. Well, folks, that is all the time we have together this week. But this, of course, would not be Rational Security if we did not leave you with some object lessons to ponder over in the week to come until we are back in your headphones. Tyler, what do you have for us this week?
This may sound a little crazy, but my object lesson for the week is the Women's National Basketball Association. It may sound silly to give this endorsement right as the season ended a few days ago. But I had the honor and great luck of attending Game 5 of the Liberty Lynx WNBA Finals game over the weekend. It was a nail biter. It was in Brooklyn. The New York Liberty came out on top in overtime. It was probably the single most thrilling sporting game I've ever attended. It was a blast. The league is growing. I'm probably preaching to the choir for a lot of listeners out there, but if you are in one of the cities that there's a WNBA team, you should go. Tickets are generally cheaper than the NBA. I don't think they'll stay that way for long. The league is growing. There are 3 more teams that over the next 2 years that are joining the league. It was an absolute blast. My object lesson is actually for the New York Liberty, but I think just getting more into the WNBA would be great. I'm also really glad, for many reasons, that Alan is not on this episode of Rational Security because he's a Lynx fan, so we may have gotten into a tussle there, but I can't recommend the WNBA enough. So look out for next season.
Get in line for season tickets now, folks. If you lock them in now, they're cheap as hell. There's always those stories of like those 3 local families that like bought Commanders tickets, like 3 team names and 5 decades ago. And so they're the only way you can afford season tickets now. So, you could be the beginning of a new wave if you get in line early.
San Francisco, Toronto, Ontario, and Portland, Oregon are the 3 cities that are getting teams in the next 2 years. So get in on the ground floor.
I didn't realize it was expanding that fast. Wow, that's amazing. Oh, wow. Very cool. Mm-hmm. Well, for my object lesson this week, I'm going to dip back into the local file. Listeners probably know I am a Washington, D.C. area native. I spend a lot of time here. I go on walks and hikes with my kids and my dog almost every weekend. So I feel like I had exhausted all of the actually fairly wonderfully abundant outdoor spaces here in Washington, D.C., at least within, a 20-minute drive to go on a hike and explore. But I discovered one just a couple weeks ago that is absolutely stunning, and somehow I feel like is not on people's radars the way it should be. And so I will shout it out if you are a DC local native. That is the Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens. A lot of people at least I did not fully understand where they were or how expansive and amazing they are, but they're essentially the other side of Anacostia from the National Arboretum. They're just like an extra 5 minutes past the Arboretum if you're coming from anywhere on that side of the Anacostia, on the kind of the northwest side of the Anacostia where the most of the city is. It is just absolutely stunning, essentially swamplands that looks like you're in a corner of the Everglades right in our nation's capital, and like a big corner of the Everglades with herons and wildlife. I saw giant turtles all over the place in the spot on the Anacostia. They have huge kind of lily pads that are growing everywhere. I'm talking like 4 or 5 foot diameter lily pads. Just absolutely phenomenal, gorgeous wetlands. Wildlife and flora and fauna, just stunning, looks completely exotic. And it makes you realize that when people say that we're a swamp here in Washington, D.C., sometimes they mean it literally, and sometimes that's a wonderful thing. And it's really gorgeous and a place that just feels like you're walking somewhere totally different. And it's just superly accessible on just a short drive away in a quarter of D.C. that, does not get enough attention. So strongly encourage people, folks, come out, check out Kenilworth Aquatic Gardens. You can even go kayaking in warmer months amidst the fronds, and looks amazing. I'm signed up to do that in a few months when it gets warmer again. So definitely check it out. I was just stunned by such an amazing spot right in the city, and encourage folks to check it out. I may be there this weekend, so if you're there and you see me, shout me out. Dan, what do you have for us this week?
So nothing nearly as cool. You and Tyler have been, out and about, and I've been sitting on my couch. So I'm going to sing the praises of a series I think many listeners know well, which is I'll say, spy thriller, if you want to call it that, Slow Horses. Part of why I want to sing its praises is that it deals with, I'll say, the human and bureaucratic factors that go into, I could say espionage, but I'll just say go into kind of professional life. And it's nice to see that show up in the context of a spy thriller, where all these things that all of us deal with on our day-to-day in offices are well represented in this actually quite fascinating set of mysteries. Both the books and the TV series are excellent. So again, I suspect this is known to many listeners, but I commend it to everyone.
Great suggestion. A repeat object lesson for good reason. Slow Horses is awesome. And also the best part about it is that even though it, like most fiction sources about espionage and spies and foreign policy, paints the government as kind of a fairly malevolent force on a lot of levels, it's not the U.S. government. So you feel a little less guilty watching it if you are a former federal employee. At least that makes it a little easier for me, if I'm being totally honest. Anna, what do you have for us? Why don't you bring us home?
Before I get to my object lesson, I do want to plus one to yours. The aquatic gardens are incredible. They also have an incredible Lotus Festival every July. And so it's also on the incredible DC Metro line. And so you can get there without a car. So check out the Lotus Festival next July if you're in DC. It is one of my favorite things to do. It's also not super hot because it's all shaded. So helpful. My actual object lesson, though, is the election cheat sheet from Bolt's magazine. It tracks elections from the, United States Senate all the way down to a local sheriff in Maricopa County. So I think it tracks hundreds of elections of key races. Highly suggest it. Also, just will generally plug Bolt's magazine. They do a lot of good work, especially on election administration stuff. I think a very, very cool nonprofit newsroom.
Absolutely. We are big Bolts fans. They've come up repeatedly here and in other aspects of lawfare work. So great recommendation. Check it out. Get ready for these last few weeks before the election, which I'm sure we are all dreading. But with that brings us to the end of this week's episode. Rational Security is, of course, a production of Lawfare, so be sure to visit us at lawfaremedia.org for our show page with links to past episodes, for our written work and the written work of other Lawfare contributors, and for information on Lawfare's other phenomenal podcast series. While you're at it, be sure to follow us on Twitter or X at RATL Security, and be sure to leave a rating or review wherever you might be listening. Also, sign up to become a material supporter for Lawfare on Patreon for an ad-free version of this podcast and other special benefits. For more information, visit lawfaremedia.org/support. Our audio engineer and producer this week was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo, and our music, as always, was performed by Sophia Yan. And we are once again edited by the wonderful Jen Patja. On behalf of my special guests, Anna, Tyler, and Dan, I am Scott R. Anderson, and we will talk to you next week. Until then, goodbye.